It began with a sealed legal envelope quietly delivered through a private Kensington Palace. Entrance one so sensitive that even senior aides were reportedly denied access to its contents. But the moment Catherine, Princess of Wales, emerged from that closed-door meeting beside Prince William, something had visibly changed. Palace staff later whispered that she looked stunned, almost emotional, because according to growing reports, lawyers had just confirmed Queen Elizabeth II left Catherine one deeply personal royal treasure, her private wedding veil. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the entire matter was treated as little more than another quiet procedural review following the late Queen's passing. Royal legal teams had reportedly been revisiting sensitive ceremonial archives for months, carefully examining private memoranda, handwritten instructions, and sealed personal bequests connected to Queen Elizabeth II's most treasured possessions. But according to palace administrative whispers, this particular review suddenly became different the moment one protected document was reopened and inside a restricted legal chamber connected to Windsor's private archive division. The reaction, insiders claim, was immediate. Meetings were rearranged, communications tightened. Senior aides were quietly told to keep their schedules clear, and within hours, discreet vehicles carrying royal lawyers were allegedly seen arriving through a side entrance at Kensington Palace under unusually strict confidentiality measures. What made the situation even more extraordinary was the level of silence surrounding it. Reports suggest even trusted palace staff were instructed not to discuss who had arrived or what documents were being examined. For an institution built on routine, hierarchy, and carefully managed visibility, that level of secrecy immediately triggered concern among those familiar with royal operations. Various interpretations of the situation began spreading behind palace walls. Some believed the legal review involved sensitive succession matters tied to the royal collection. Others reportedly feared the discovery of previously unseen instructions left privately by the Queen herself. But few were prepared for the emotional gravity attached to the item that would ultimately emerge at the center of the storm. The Queen's own wedding veil, preserved for decades as one of the most intimate symbols of her personal history. According to insiders familiar with the meeting, Catherine and William remained behind closed doors with legal advisors for more than 2 hours. No official statement followed. No public acknowledgement emerged. Yet those who reportedly witnessed Catherine leaving the room later described a moment of visible emotion that immediately fueled speculation throughout royal circles. Palace staff whispered that she appeared overwhelmed, almost unable to process the magnitude of what had just been explained to her. And perhaps most startling of all were growing claims that the veil had not merely been catalogued among ceremonial artifacts, but specifically named in a protected private memorandum personally connected to Queen Elizabeth II's final wishes. That distinction changed everything, because this was no longer being viewed as a historical object quietly preserved for institutional purposes. According to royal insiders, the Queen had allegedly made a conscious and deeply personal decision about who should inherit it. The symbolism behind tea. Hat choice exploded almost instantly inside royal commentary circles. Historians and palace observers began quietly questioning why the late monarch would entrust such an emotionally important piece to Catherine directly rather than allowing it to remain permanently within the formal royal collection system. Reports suggest the veil carried significance far beyond fashion, jewelry, or ceremonial nostalgia. It represented continuity, stability, duty. For many inside the monarchy, Queen Elizabeth II's 1947 wedding symbolized the rebuilding of national hope after war and uncertainty. To privately pass that artifact to Catherine, some believe, may have reflected the Queen's personal view of who could best carry forward the emotional center of the institution itself. And once that theory began circulating, the atmosphere inside palace circles reportedly became even more tense. Because the deeper people looked into the Queen's final private decisions, the more questions emerged about what they revealed regarding the monarchy's future direction. Royal commentators began revisiting Catherine's relationship with the late Queen, pointing toward years of quiet loyalty, discipline, and careful respect for tradition. Unlike others who allegedly sought influence through publicity or disruption, Catherine had long been viewed by senior courtiers as someone who understood the unspoken rhythm of royal duty. Sources close to palace staff claim the Queen deeply valued that restraint, especially during the increasingly turbulent final years of her reign. And now, according to growing whispers inside royal circles, this inheritance was being interpreted not merely as sentimental affection, but as something far more profound, a deeply symbolic gesture of trust. But the veil itself was only the beginning, because buried beneath that emotional revelation was a far larger story about loyalty, legacy, and the Queen's final private judgments. Long before lawyers reopened the Queen's private archives, the wedding veil itself had already become something of a royal ghost, rarely discussed, carefully protected, and surrounded by layers of palace secrecy that stretched back decades. For most of the public, the veil existed only as part of a distant black and white memory tied to one of the most important royal weddings in modern history. In 1947, as Britain was still recovering from the war, astute of war, the future Queen Elizabeth stepped into Westminster Abbey carrying not just the hopes of a monarchy, but the emotional weight of an exhausted nation searching desperately for stability again. The gown became legendary. The ceremony became historic. But according to palace historians, it was the veil itself that quietly carried the deepest emotional significance for the young princess, who would later become queen. Reports suggest Queen Elizabeth viewed it not simply as ceremonial fabric, but as a deeply personal reminder of sacrifice, endurance, and the terrifying responsibility that had already begun surrounding her long before she wore the crown. Over time, the artifact reportedly disappeared into the most protected layers of royal preservation. Unlike publicly displayed jewels or state regalia regularly viewed through exhibitions and official archives, the veil was allegedly treated differently. Sources familiar with palace conservation procedures claim it remained under extraordinary protection measures for decades, stored in climate-controlled conditions with access tightly restricted even among senior royal personnel. Various interpretations of this secrecy began circulating years before the Queen's passing. Some believed the veil's delicate condition demanded unusual care. Others quietly suspected the late monarch attached an emotional importance to it that went far beyond historical preservation. Because according to insiders, this was one of the few surviving objects directly connected to Elizabeth's final years before duty consumed nearly every private part of her life. Palace historians reportedly viewed the veil almost as a sacred thread connecting two different eras of Britain itself. It represented hope after destruction, continuity after chaos, the beginning of a life that would eventually become inseparable from national identity. Those familiar with royal archival traditions claim the Queen rarely discussed the piece publicly because of the intensely personal emotions attached to it. And perhaps even more revealing were persistent whispers that only a very small circle of trusted senior royals had ever been privately allowed to view it in person. That detail alone transformed the artifact from historical treasure into something far more emotionally loaded within palace culture. Access meant trust. Trust meant significance. And significance inside royal life always carried consequences. As Catherine's name became increasingly tied to the inheritance, royal commentators immediately began revisiting the unusual bond she reportedly shared with the late Queen. For years, palace observers had quietly noted Elizabeth's visible comfort around Catherine's calm, disciplined presence. Unlike louder personalities who allegedly unsettled palace routines, Catherine was often described by insiders as someone who instinctively understood the monarchy's deeper rhythms without needing constant guidance. Reports suggest her admiration for royal history strengthened that relationship even further. She reportedly approached royal tradition not as performance, but as responsibility. And according to those close to palace operations, that distinction mattered enormously to Queen Elizabeth during the increasingly unstable later years of her reign. The comparison soon became impossible to ignore. Commentators began drawing striking parallels between Catherine's quiet public image and the young Elizabeth, who once entered royal life under crushing pressure while maintaining an almost painful sense of composure. Both women, observe, Arvers claimed projected restraint during moments when others around them struggled publicly with emotion, conflict, or ambition. But then the story grew even more explosive after whispers emerged, suggesting the Queen may have attached private handwritten notes to the veil itself. Notes that allegedly explained why the artifact was being entrusted personally rather than absorbed permanently into institutional royal collections. That revelation changed the tone of the entire story almost overnight. Because if true, it meant the inheritance was not administrative. It was intentional, personal, emotional. And suddenly, a haunting question began echoing throughout palace circles and royal media alike. Why would Queen Elizabeth privately assign one of the most emotionally important artifacts of her entire life to Catherine specifically? Why not preserve it publicly for the institution itself? Why quietly place it into the hands of the future Princess of Wales, unless the Queen believed Catherine represented something larger than tradition alone? Observers increasingly speculated the veil may have symbolized the late monarch's deepest hopes for continuity inside an increasingly fractured oil world. Not power, not glamour, but steadiness, discipline, endurance. The very qualities Elizabeth herself had spent a lifetime trying to protect. However, as historians focused on the veil's emotional symbolism, insiders quietly hinted that another private conversation inside Windsor Castle had changed everything years before the Queen's passing. Reports now suggest the true story may trace back to one deeply personal moment between Queen Elizabeth II and Catherine. An encounter so private that even senior members of the household were allegedly unaware of what was discussed behind those palace doors. According to whispers now circulating through royal circles, the conversation may have taken place during one of the Queen's quieter periods at Windsor Castle, long before the public fully understood how fragile her health had become. At the time, palace life was already under enormous strain. The monarchy faced constant public scrutiny. Internal divisions were reportedly worsening behind closed doors. And King Charles himself was said to be carrying the growing burden of transition even before officially taking the throne. Yet amid all that uncertainty, insiders claim Queen Elizabeth increasingly focused her attention on one question above all others. Who could steady the institution once she was gone? And according to various palace interpretations, her private confidence in Catherine had already begun deepening in ways few outside the inner household truly recognized. Sources familiar with Windsor operations described Catherine as someone the Queen reportedly viewed with rare trust. Not because she sought influence loudly or attempted to dominate royal life through headlines, but precisely because she did the opposite. Again and again, insiders claim Catherine demonstrated an instinctive respect for protocol, restraint, and what one longtime palace observer allegedly called the sacred rhythm of royal duty. That phrase began resurfacing constantly once rumors surrounding the veil inheritance exploded into public conversation. Because to Queen Elizabeth, the monarchy was never merely performance. It was discipline, continuity, endurance through suffering without public collapse. And reports suggest she increasingly saw those same qualities emerging quietly inside Catherine during some of the family's most turbulent years. Royal experts now point toward several painful periods that may have shaped the Queen's perspective permanently. Through scandals, media storms, internal betrayals, and relentless pressure surrounding the institution's future, Catherine rarely responded publicly with anger or emotional chaos. Insiders claim the Queen deeply admired that composure. Various interpretations of palace conversations suggest Elizabeth viewed Catherine's calm handling of pressure as evidence that she understood something fundamental about survival inside royal life. The crown could only endure if certain people were willing to absorb pain silently for the sake of stability. That belief reportedly resonated deeply with the Queen, especially during her final years when she allegedly feared public confidence in the monarchy had become dangerously fragile. And suddenly, the veil inheritance began looking far less like a sentimental gesture and far more like a symbolic transfer of responsibility. Royal historians and commentators increasingly speculated that the Queen never intended the artifact to function as a simple personal gift. Instead, insiders suggest it may have represented a deeply private acknowledgement that Catherine would one day Why inherit a burden remarkably similar to Elizabeth's own early transition into duty? The parallels became impossible for royal watchers to ignore. A young woman marrying into the monarchy during uncertain times, public expectations growing heavier by the year, emotional sacrifices hidden beneath careful composure, an entire institution slowly depending on her ability to remain steady while chaos unfolded around her. To some observers, the symbolism attached to the veil suddenly became almost overwhelming. Palace commentators also began revisiting the Queen's lifelong obsession with discretion. Unlike newer generations shaped by publicity cycles and emotional interviews, Elizabeth reportedly believed silence itself carried power. She rarely rewarded theatrics. She distrusted emotional instability. And according to insiders, she valued quiet loyalty above almost every other royal quality. That may explain why whispers surrounding the inheritance remained hidden for so long. Some sources now believe the Queen intentionally avoided making public declarations, because she understood the political consequences they could create within the family. Instead, reports suggest she left behind UBTL but unmistakable signals through private memoranda, protected instructions, and deeply symbolic personal decisions meant to guide the monarchy after her death without openly igniting conflict during her lifetime. Perhaps most striking of all were claims that Prince William immediately understood the emotional gravity behind the inheritance once lawyers revealed the Queen's decision. Sources close to palace operations suggest he recognized instantly that the veil represented far more than history or affection. It represented trust at the highest possible level. Not only in Catherine as his wife, but in Catherine as the woman the Queen believed could help preserve the institution itself through an uncertain future. Yet according to several insiders, Catherine allegedly struggled emotionally with the magnitude of that responsibility once the full meaning became clear. Because receiving such a deeply personal artifact reportedly felt less like privilege, and more like inheriting a silent promise she now feared she had to live up to forever. But while Catherine reportedly saw the inheritance as a deeply personal responsibility, not everyone inside royal circles was said to welcome the revelation so calmly. The moment whispers about the Queen's private veil inheritance began circulating through palace corridors, the atmosphere reportedly shifted from quiet reflection to icy political tension almost overnight. At first, the discussions remained contained within the inner machinery of royal administration. Small conversations behind closed office doors, quiet exchanges between legal advisors, courtiers lowering their voices the moment someone unexpected entered the room. But according to insiders familiar with palace operations, it quickly became obvious this was no ordinary inheritance matter. The emotional significance attached to Queen Elizabeth II's wedding veil transformed the situation into something politically dangerous almost immediately. Because inside monarchy culture, symbolism often matters more than money, titles, or even property itself. And many reportedly understood exactly what message the inheritance could send if details ever became public. Sources now claim palace households quietly divided into opposing camps over whether the information should remain permanently sealed. Some senior figures allegedly argued the Queen's private wishes deserted absolute confidentiality in order to avoid unnecessary comparisons within the family. Others reportedly believed suppressing the truth entirely would only create even more damaging speculation later if leaks inevitably surfaced. And according to several royal commentators, fear began spreading through certain palace circles for one specific reason above all others: the growing comparison between Catherine and the women who came before her. Because once the inheritance became linked publicly to Queen Elizabeth's personal trust, the conversation immediately evolved into something far larger than a simple ceremonial artifact. It became a question of succession, symbolism, and the monarchy's emotional future. Media insiders reportedly noticed the shift almost instantly. Royal correspondents began speaking in increasingly careful language about Catherine's evolving role within the institution, while palace analysts quietly floated phrases like future queen energy and Elizabeth's natural successor. The effect inside royal circles was reportedly explosive. According to various interpretations of internal discussions, some figures feared the inheritance risked strengthening Catherine's Ni's public standing so dramatically that it could unintentionally overshadow other senior members of the family. Because unlike official promotions or ceremonial titles, symbolic gestures from Queen Elizabeth herself carried a uniquely emotional authority that could not easily be controlled once public imagination attached meaning to them. And in this case, the symbolism was almost impossible to ignore. Commentators increasingly argued the Vale inheritance reinforced Catherine's image not simply as the Princess of Wales, but as the spiritual continuation of the Queen's values. That interpretation reportedly unsettled certain palace insiders deeply. For decades, Queen Elizabeth represented stability during some of Britain's most uncertain moments. To suggest she personally chose Catherine as guardian of one of her most emotionally important possessions implied something much more profound than affection. It hinted at endorsement. Trust. Confidence in Catherine's ability to preserve the monarchy's emotional center after Elizabeth's passing. And once those theories began circulating through media circles, palace aides allegedly moved aggressively to contain further leaks before speculation spiraled completely out of control. Reports suggest internal communications tightened almost immediately. Staff were allegedly reminded about confidentiality obligations. Discussions surrounding archival reviews reportedly became heavily restricted. Some insiders even claimed certain aides feared additional private memoranda connected to the Queen's personal wishes might eventually emerge if scrutiny intensified. At the same time, questions quietly began surfacing throughout royal circles about whether all members of the family had truly expected this arrangement. Various interpretations of palace dynamics suggested some individuals may have assumed the Vale would remain permanently absorbed into institutional collections rather than entrusted personally to Catherine. That possibility alone reportedly created enormous tension beneath the surface of palace life. Yet perhaps the most politically sensitive theory involved what the inheritance may have represented emotionally from the Queen herself. Some insiders increasingly viewed the decision as a subtle but deliberate statement from Elizabeth about the future direction of the monarchy after her death. Royal historians repeated. Lai emphasized that symbolic artifacts inside royal culture often carry enormous invisible power precisely because they communicate values without requiring public declarations. A title can be debated. A speech can be reinterpreted. But a private inheritance tied directly to emotional trust often reveals what formal institutions cannot openly say. And according to those closest to the unfolding situation, that realization began unsettling palace dynamics far more than anyone initially anticipated. Through all of it, Catherine reportedly refused to engage publicly with the growing speculation. No statement emerged. No emotional response was offered. Sources claim she remained determined to treat the matter with dignity and restraint despite mounting pressure from both media and internal palace attention. But insiders also suggest William became increasingly protective as the intensity surrounding the inheritance escalated, because by then, the issue was no longer simply about a veil. It had become a symbol people were projecting onto the future of the monarchy itself. And behind palace walls, many reportedly understood that once symbolism reaches that level inside royal life, the sequences rarely remain contained for long. Yet the deeper lawyers examined the Queen's private records, the more it reportedly became clear that the veil was tied to something even more powerful than sentiment alone. By the time palace lawyers reportedly finished reviewing the Queen's final private memoranda, insiders claimed the emotional weight surrounding the wedding veil had transformed into something far more profound, a final message about the future of the crown itself. What allegedly stunned those involved most was not simply the existence of the inheritance, but the language quietly attached to it. According to reports emerging from palace-adjacent circles, accompanying notes connected to the veil emphasized themes the late Queen had spent her entire reign defending. Continuity, humility, restraint, and lifelong service to something greater than personal ambition. Those familiar with royal traditions claim Queen Elizabeth rarely left emotionally expressive instructions behind. She believed actions carried greater meaning than dramatic declarations. Yet insiders now suggest the memoranda surrounding the veil may have been among the clearest reflections of how she privately viewed the monarchy's uncertain future during her final years. And once fragments of those interpretations began circulating beyond palace walls, the entire story evolved into something much larger than a family inheritance dispute. Royal commentators quickly framed the veil as a symbol of duty over celebrity, a phrase that reportedly resonated deeply inside traditional royal circles already exhausted by years of public conflict, media warfare, and institutional instability. According to various interpretations from palace observers, the inheritance appeared to reinforce the exact qualities Queen Elizabeth valued most throughout her 70-year reign: discipline under pressure, emotional control during crisis, and quiet loyalty even when public admiration fluctuated. Catherine's growing association with those values only intensified the symbolism. Because unlike more modern royal figures who often became defined through visibility and public narrative battles, Catherine increasingly represented something older, calmer, and far more familiar to supporters of the traditional monarchy. Historians soon began comparing the moment to earlier transitions inside royal history where Symbolism carried invisible but enormous power. Some pointed toward Queen Mary carefully guiding the future Queen Elizabeth during moments of constitutional uncertainty. Others referenced private inheritances and personal gestures exchanged quietly between generations of royal women, as a way of preserving continuity during periods when the institution itself appeared vulnerable. In monarchy culture, historians argued, symbolic objects often become emotional anchors for entire eras. A crown may represent authority, but personal artifacts represent trust. And according to palace insiders, Queen Elizabeth reportedly understood that distinction better than anyone alive. That may explain why sources increasingly claim she wanted certain deeply personal items protected from institutional politics altogether. Because once an artifact enters formal royal collections permanently, it no longer belongs emotionally to one person. It becomes absorbed into systems, committees, exhibitions, and public interpretation. Yet insiders now believe the Queen may have intentionally resisted allowing the veil to disappear into that machinery. Reports suggest she wanted it preserved through personal stewards. Hip rather than bureaucratic management. And if true, that decision says something extraordinary about how she viewed Catherine specifically. Not merely as a future queen beside William, but as someone capable of protecting the emotional integrity of royal history itself without exploiting it for attention or influence. That interpretation reportedly left many within palace circles deeply unsettled once its implications became harder to ignore. Sources close to Kensington Palace claim Catherine herself understood the inheritance as a burden as much as an honor. The emotional pressure surrounding the revelation allegedly intensified dramatically as public fascination exploded worldwide. Media coverage spread rapidly across Britain, Europe, America, and Commonwealth nations, with commentators dissecting every possible implication tied to the Queen's private decision. Some portrayed the inheritance as a final blessing from Elizabeth herself. Others viewed it as a subtle constitutional signal about where the monarchy's emotional center now truly rested. Yet through all the speculation, insiders described the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace as remarkably restrained. Emotional, certain, only, but controlled. Almost protective in tone. Because according to sources familiar with William and Catherine's reaction, both reportedly recognized how politically sensitive the situation had become. William, in particular, was said to view the revelation as confirmation of something he had quietly sensed for years: the Queen's deep confidence in Catherine's ability to stabilize the institution during difficult times ahead. That understanding reportedly carried enormous emotional weight for him privately, especially because so much of the monarchy's future now appeared uncertain following the Queen's death and the pressures surrounding King Charles's reign. Meanwhile, discussions intensified among royal observers over whether Elizabeth had intentionally shaped Catherine's symbolic future roll through a series of quiet decisions long before the public ever realized it. And increasingly, commentators argued the veil inheritance reinforced the monarchy's traditional center of gravity: service, restraint, continuity at a moment when many feared those values were slowly disappearing from public life altogether. But as the story spread beyond palace walls, one final question continued haunting royal observers everywhere. Why did the Queen choose Catherine personally for something so intimate and irreplaceable? In the end, insiders insist Catherine never sought the spotlight surrounding the Queen's veil. Yet in many ways, that may have been exactly why the late monarch trusted her with it in the first place. As the frenzy surrounding the inheritance slowly began settling into quieter reflection, one detail reportedly continued standing out to those closest to the royal household. Catherine never attempted to turn the revelation into spectacle. No dramatic public appearances followed. No carefully orchestrated statements emerged. No emotional interviews were offered to shape public sympathy or control the narrative. According to palace observers, that restraint only deepened the emotional power surrounding the story. Because in a modern era often dominated by publicity battles and relentless image management, Catherine's silence reportedly felt strikingly similar to the values Queen Elizabeth herself spent decades defending. And the more people reflected on that contrast, the more the veil appeared to symbolize something far larger than a private family. Inheritance. Royal commentators increasingly described Catherine's approach as grounded, disciplined, and deeply respectful of the emotional history attached to the artifact. Sources familiar with palace dynamics claim she viewed the veil not as a prize to display, but as a responsibility connected to generations of royal women who carried the institution through periods of uncertainty, sacrifice, and public pressure. That perspective reportedly resonated powerfully with traditional supporters of the monarchy, many of whom had grown weary of years defined by division, personal grievances, and public conflict inside the royal family. To them, Catherine represented a quieter form of strength, one rooted not in visibility, but in endurance. And according to insiders, that may have been precisely the quality Queen Elizabeth hoped would survive after her passing. The symbolism attached to the veil only grew stronger as historians began drawing deeper. Parallels between Elizabeth's wartime generation and Catherine's modern role inside the monarchy. In 1947, the future queen married during a period of rationing, hardship, and national exhaustion, becoming a symbol of stability during uncertain times. Decades later, Catherine entered royal life during another deeply fragile period, though the battles surrounding the institution looked very different. Media storms replaced wartime destruction. Public distrust replaced post-war fear. Yet the emotional burden remained strikingly familiar. Both women, observers argued, faced immense pressure to preserve continuity while navigating enormous personal sacrifices behind palace walls. And increasingly, royal historians began suggesting the veil represented a symbolic bridge between those two eras of duty. Inside the institution itself, reports suggest the inheritance quietly strengthened William and Catherine's, standing among those who viewed the monarchy's future through a more traditional lens. Palace sources claim many senior figures interpreted the Queen's private decision as confirmation that the Prince and Princess of Wales represented stability at a moment when the institution desperately needed emotional grounding. The monarchy, according to several commentators, now appeared to be entering a quieter but more disciplined era, one shaped less by spectacle and more by controlled continuity. That shift reportedly reflected the Queen's deepest instincts about survival. She had spent a lifetime understanding that monarchies rarely collapse from a lack of glamour. They collapse when discipline disappears. And insiders increasingly believe she carefully considered symbolic succession long before her death, precisely because she feared how fragile the institution could become without it. What began as palace gossip surrounding a hidden inheritance gradually evolved into something much more reflective and emotionally significant. The story no longer centered solely on who received the veil. Instead, it became a wider conversation about legacy itself, about what Queen Elizabeth truly valued after 7 decades on the throne, about which qualities she believed could still protect the monarchy during an age defined by instability and relentless public scrutiny. And according to sources close to Kensington Palace, Catherine reportedly remained deeply moved by the responsibility attached to the artifact long after the headlines intensified. Because those closest to the situation claim she understood something many outside royal life never fully could. Symbolic trust from Queen Elizabeth carried emotional weight that could last a lifetime. Now, Royal historians increasingly argue the inheritance may ultimately become remembered as one of the most symbolic private gestures of the Queen's final years. Not because of the veil's material value, not because of ceremony or public fascination, but because of what the decision appeared to reveal about the late monarch's final hopes for the institution she spent her life protecting. In Catherine, many believe Elizabeth saw continuity without arrogance, duty without performance, and strength without chaos. And perhaps that was the true meaning hidden beneath the silence surrounding the inheritance all along. And as the palace settles back into silence, the image that continues haunting royal watchers is not the veil itself but the stunned expression on Catherine's face when she realized the Queen had trusted her to carry its legacy forward. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.